There is a story that has been circulating for decades in the corridors of the British press, in documentaries about the royal family, and in the conversations of millions of people who followed every chapter of the most observed marriage of the 20th century. The story goes that Queen Elizabeth II issued an order, a direct, firm instruction without exception. Camilla Parker Bowles would never cross the threshold of Diana's bedroom at Kensington Palace. That room would remain intact, exactly as the princess had left it, protected by the express will of the sovereign. It is a story that has everything necessary to survive: a protective queen, a woman considered an intruder by millions, a space turned into a symbol of a nation's pain, and a closed door that no one could open. But before continuing to repeat that story because it sounds convincing, it is worth pausing and asking the question that few ask. Did it really happen that way? That is the path we are going to travel today, not to demolish Diana's memory or to vindicate Camilla, but to understand what is real in this story, what is legend, and why both things matter if we want to understand what really happened behind the walls of Kensington Palace. If you believe that Diana's story deserves something better than rumors presented as proven facts, stay. What we find when we follow the trail of the documents turns out to be more interesting than any simplified version that has circulated so far. Before talking about the room, you have to understand the house. The first problem with the tale of the Forbidden Room is one of definition. When people talk about Diana's room, the image that usually appears is that of an intimate bedroom, perhaps with the bed just as it was on the last night, the perfume bottles on the vanity, the photographs of her children resting against the wall. That image is emotionally powerful. It is also inaccurate. What the world calls Diana's room was actually an extensive set of apartments inside Kensington Palace. Specifically, apartments number 8 and 9, which were combined to form a multi-level residence after Charles and Diana's wedding in 1981. It was not a room. It was an entire house hidden inside a historic palatial estate. To understand it correctly, one must understand that in the language of British royal residences, the word apartment does not mean the same as in common usage. In Kensington, an apartment can include formal reception rooms for entertaining guests, workspaces, private bedrooms, a dining room, rooms for staff, and corridors connecting an entire level of separate domestic life from the rest of the building. Apartments 8 and 9 at Kensington included all of that. The layout was unique. On the lower floors were the more formal spaces, the reception rooms, Diana's work areas, and the rooms where she received visitors. At the top were the children's rooms, an entire floor dedicated to William and Harry. This configuration explains why the place ended up accumulating so many meanings. In the very hours that Diana held meetings with her team or received public figures in the living rooms, her children played above her head. It was a royal residence. But it was also a family home, and that dual condition is the key to understanding everything that came after. When Diana arrived there in 1981, she was 20 years old. She worked with the decorator Dudley Poplack to create an interior that was not solely ceremonial. Photographs from that time show rooms with soft colors, delicate prints, furniture in which the preference of a young woman could be recognized. It was not the severe atmosphere of a stateroom. It was a space where life could be lived. However, it is important not to lose sight of an essential aspect. Diana was not the legal owner of those rooms in the conventional sense. Residences at Kensington Palace are spaces institutionally assigned to members of the royal family. They function similarly to grace and favor residences linked to a position. The person who lives there does so by virtue of their position, not because they acquired the property. That means the emotional identity a space accumulates over time can be completely real, while at the same time, the institutional ownership remains with the crown. That distinction matters when we analyze what the Queen may or may not have ordered, and what those instructions would have actually implied, why Kensington became Diana's territory. There is a significant difference between Charles and Diana's relationship with their two main residences. Highgrove, the country house in Gloucestershire, was deeply associated with Charles's personal interests. The gardens, rural life, the customs he cultivated away from London. The official history of Diana identifies Highgrove as the couple's primary home. Kensington, however, was the London base, and over the years it increasingly became Diana's emotional territory. Her children were there, her staff, her correspondence, the offices from which she organized her public work. As the marriage deteriorated, Kensington stopped being a shared space and began to function as an environment where Diana built a life that depended less and less on her husband's life. Charles had his own spaces, his work flowed from St. James's Palace. His rural commitments kept him in Gloucestershire. Kensington, on the other hand, was where the children were and where Diana worked. From the outside, the building remained the London residence of the Prince and Princess of Wales. From the inside, it had become something more specific, the place where Diana learnt to organise a life of her own, while her marriage fell apart out of public view. That explains why the legend of the Forbidden Room became so easily believable. It was not just any royal space. It was the place where Diana had raised William and Harry, where she had built her independent identity, where she had decided that her life could no longer be defined solely by her relationship with Charles. For millions of Diana's admirers, allowing Camilla to occupy that space would have meant something very specific. Not only that Camilla was marrying Charles, but that Diana's history in that place could be rewritten, overlapped, and eventually erased. The rumor of the ban offered an answer to that fear, a closed door that no one could cross. But before finding out if that door actually existed, we must retrace what happened after the separation. Diana in Kensington after the separation. In December 1992, Buckingham Palace announced that the Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to separate. The marriage still existed in legal terms, but the shared life was over. What followed that announcement is of decisive importance to this story. Charles and Diana did not divide the spaces at Kensington, they simply stopped sharing them. Charles consolidated his professional life at St. James's Palace and his personal life at Highgrove. Diana stayed at Kensington. There she maintained her residence, and from there she continued to operate her personal office. This detail completely eliminates one of the most repeated premises of the rumor. The version that circulated for years suggested that Charles had tried to move Camilla into Kensington after the separation, and that the Queen had intervened to prevent it. However, during that period, Kensington was Diana's active residence. There was no empty space to occupy. There was no practical possibility of installing anyone else there, as long as Diana continued to live within those walls. No secret order from the Queen was necessary. The obstacles already existed and were perfectly visible. Diana was still there, she was the mother of the heir to the throne, and she had a public presence of enormous magnitude. Any move that seemed to displace her from her home would have generated a crisis of extraordinary proportions. The divorce was finalized on August 28, 1996. Diana lost her Royal Highness style, but retained the title of Diana, Princess of Wales. The royal family also confirmed that she would continue to be recognized as a member of the family by virtue of being the mother of William and Harry. And the most important point for this narrative, she continued living in Kensington. She maintained both her residence and her office there. She continued working with her patronages, receiving correspondence, preparing international engagements, and returning after each public appearance to the same apartments where she had lived for 15 years. During the months of 1997, leading up to the summer, Diana carried out an active agenda. She participated in a charity auction of her dresses. She traveled to Angola and Bosnia as part of her campaign against landmines. She returned to Kensington. It remained the place she returned to. Then came August 1997. The last departure. Diana died in Paris during the early hours of August 31st, 1997. The news reached Great Britain before dawn. In Kensington, the apartments remained exactly as they were. The woman who was supposed to return to them never would. What occurred in the hours and days that followed has no equivalent in the recent history of the British monarchy. People who had never met Diana began walking toward the palace. The first bouquets appeared near the gates. Then came candles, photographs, handwritten letters, and drawings by children who did not fully understand what had happened, but knew that something was broken. By the Wednesday following the accident, the flowers extended several meters from the palace entrance, forming a silent tide that no organizer had summoned. The gates of Kensington became an emotional border. On one side was the public processing a collective loss. On the other were the apartments where Diana had lived, where her children had grown up, where she had learned to be herself away from the camera. Most of those who wept outside the palace had never seen the interior. They did not know which was Diana's bedroom, how the rooms were laid out, or what was inside those walls. But that lack of knowledge did not weaken their emotional bond with the place. It intensified it. The silence behind the gates allowed each person to fill the void with their own version, and the most common version was also the most painful. Inside those apartments, the life that Diana would never finish living still existed, intact. On September 5th, Diana's coffin was moved from St. James's Palace to Kensington, where it remained for one night. The next morning, more than 1 million people gathered along the route to Westminster Abbey. The cortege departed from Kensington Palace at 9:08 in the morning. That journey permanently cemented a connection that already existed but became permanent that day. The palace from which Diana had departed for 15 years to fulfill her engagements became the place from which she departed for the last time. Over the years, that connection took concrete forms. The gardens Diana frequented were temporarily transformed into the White Garden to commemorate the 20th anniversary of her death, using white flowers as a silent tribute. Later, William and Harry commissioned a statue of their mother. It was unveiled on July 1st, 2021, the day Diana would have turned 60, in the same sunken garden of Kensington Palace. According to the historic Royal Palace's press release, the princes wanted to recognize their mother's influence and help new generations understand her place in history. Kensington was no longer just the place where Diana had lived. It was the place where Great Britain had gone to mourn her and where her own children had decided to publicly preserve part of her memory. This context is indispensable for understanding what would come next, because it was in that space charged with symbolism that the story of the ban began to circulate. The rumor and its versions, the legend of the Forbidden Room, did not appear all at once in a single, defined form. It grew and mutated over time, accumulating new details every time someone told it. In its most widespread version, the story claims that Queen Elizabeth issued a direct and definitive instruction: Camilla Parker Bowles would never enter the room where Diana had slept. Period. No exceptions. In some variations, the ban extends to all of apartments 8 and 9. In others, it is reduced to the master bedroom. The more elaborate versions add a scene of confrontation. Camilla allegedly tried to claim the residence for herself and Charles, and the Queen personally intervened to stop her. There are tales of guards posted outside a specific door. Others describe the bedroom preserved exactly as Diana had left it, with her personal items in place, her photographs on the walls, her belongings intact. It is a story built with powerful elements. The Queen as a guardian, the home of a mother protected from the reach of the intruder, a space that time had not touched. But the more each element is analyzed, the harder it is to sustain the first and most important question is the simplest. Is there verifiable proof that this order was issued? Not an anonymous testimony published in a gossip magazine 20 years later. Not a source claiming to have heard from someone who was close to someone who knows. A document, a statement, a contemporary report from a reputable journalistic publication, an identified an oh, oh, mm. Royal families have many conversations that never transcend, and it would be naive to assume that everything that happens at Buckingham Palace ends up documented in the public record. But there is a huge difference between saying we cannot confirm it happened and turning it into a historical fact presented with certainty. The second claim of the rumor, that of the bedroom preserved intact, also encounters problems when examining the available evidence. In 2008, The Guardian newspaper published information about renovation work on the Kensington apartments. According to that report, the former residence had remained empty for approximately a decade before work began. Renovation costs exceeded initial estimates because builders had been unable to inspect all the rooms beforehand. When they were able to enter, they discovered that the heating system and installations were in worse condition than calculated. That description is not that of a bedroom maintained as a private shrine with personal objects in place. It is that of a closed residence, which had been uninhabited for a decade, which had deteriorated due to the simple passage of time, and which required major work to be functional again. There was no sanctuary. There were aging rooms waiting to be renovated. The third claim, that Camilla tried to claim those apartments, also lacks documentary support. There is no public record of her making a formal request to occupy apartments 8 and 9. And from a practical standpoint, by the time Charles and Camilla married in 2005, he had already organized his London life elsewhere. That other place was Clarence House. Clarence House and the question of home. To understand why Camilla never lived in Diana's apartments, one must understand that Charles did not need them either. After the death of the Queen Mother in 2002, Clarence House was renovated to become the official London residence of the Prince of Wales. A royal statement in 2003 confirmed that this would be Charles's new home. His offices, his staff, and his private life moved there. And when Camilla became his wife in 2005, Clarence House also became her residence. This fact removes one of the central elements of the drama. There was no competition between Camilla and Diana's memory for control of Kensington, because Charles had already established his base in a completely different building. He did not need Kensington, he had Clarence House, and there he built the domestic life he would share with Camilla in the following years. From a strictly logistical standpoint, the question of whether Camilla could live in Diana's apartments was never really urgent. The practical answer already existed before anyone needed to ask it. Charles had another home, perfectly adequate, completely separate from any association with Diana. But perhaps the most important question is not whether Camilla would have wanted to live there. It is whether it would have been possible in political and symbolic terms to install her in that space without causing a crisis of disproportionate scales. The answer to that question is more revealing than any secret order. Installing Camilla in the apartments where Diana had raised William and Harry would have sent a message that the royal family would have been unable to control. It would have looked not only like Camilla was replacing Diana as Charles's wife, but physically occupying the space of her domestic life. Not just any space. The one the entire world had seen covered in flowers in 1997, the one her children remembered as their childhood home with their mother. In that context, an express instruction from the Queen was not needed for that move to be unthinkable. The combination of public sensitivity, William and Harry's position, the palace's association with national mourning, and the availability of Clarence House as a perfectly viable alternative meant that the question answered itself. But that does not mean that Elizabeth II's attitude toward Camilla is without history. It has one, and that history is much more complex than simple, permanent enmity. What the Queen actually did with Camilla. To understand Elizabeth II's position toward Camilla Parker Bowles, one must abandon the image of an implacable queen who blocked that woman's every step for decades. The public record tells a different story, slower, more calculated, more nuanced, and ultimately more revealing of how the monarchy functions when it has to adapt to realities it did not choose. In the years following Diana's death in 1997, any attempt to quickly present Camilla as Charles's official companion would have been politically and emotionally devastating. The country was processing an unprecedented loss in terms of popular reaction. The sentiment toward Camilla among large sections of the public was one of outright rejection, and the royal family was already going through its moment of greatest institutional fragility in decades. In that context, Camilla withdrew almost completely from public visibility. Whatever plans may have existed to gradually integrate her into Charles's official life were abandoned or postponed indefinitely. The prince's team had to move with extraordinary caution. The Queen maintained her distance. It is not necessary to resort to unverified private statements to document this. Elizabeth II's own public behavior during those years reflects a deliberate reserve. For a prolonged period, she avoided appearing in social contexts where Camilla was also present. That position began to change in the year 2000. In June of that year, Charles organized a celebration at Highgrove for the birthday of King Constantine, the former king of Greece. The Queen knew that Camilla would be among the guests, and she decided to attend. The meeting was not publicly presented as a moment of reconciliation. There was no official photograph of the two women together, nor a statement explaining the meaning of the encounter. But the British press understood it immediately. The Guardian described that moment as the end of an effective boycott. A source connected to the royal family explained in more direct terms that the time had come to show some degree of acceptance toward the woman the heir to the throne had chosen. The importance of that meeting at Highgrove does not reside in any conversation that might have taken place inside the house. It resides in the fact that the Queen chose to enter knowing exactly what her presence would convey. For years she had avoided publicly crossing paths with Camilla in social settings. In 2000 she decided to cross that boundary. That did not erase what had happened. It did not turn Camilla overnight into a welcome member of the royal family, but it established that the monarchy was capable of moving forward, even if it did so with the slow pace characteristic of an institution that measures every step. The next significant milestone was the 2005 marriage. Charles and Camilla married on April 9th of that year in a civil ceremony at the Windsor Guildhall. Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were not present for that first part. For years, that absence was interpreted as an unequivocal sign of disapproval from the Queen. But the story does not end there, and it is incomplete to tell it without the conclusion. On the same day, the Queen and Philip attended the service of prayer and dedication held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. The religious ceremony was followed by a reception at the castle itself, hosted by the Queen. Camilla emerged from that day as Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Cornwall. That was not exclusion, it was an acceptance administered with care. The Queen distinguished between the civil ceremony, where she preferred not to be, and the religious and social act which she herself organized and in which she did participate. It was a nuanced position, perhaps uncomfortable for those who preferred simpler answers, but consistent with the way this institution navigates unprecedented situations. What came next in the following years makes it even harder to sustain the image of a permanent and irreducible hostility. In April 2012, the Queen personally granted Camilla the rank of Dame Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order. This honour has a particular meaning because it is not granted by political or parliamentary recommendation. It is delivered directly by the sovereign in recognition of services rendered to the crown. It is, in that sense, one of the most personal gestures a monarch can make. In 2016, Camilla was appointed a member of the Privy Council, the formal advisory body to the crown. On December 31, 2021, she was appointed a Royal Lady of the Order of the Garter, the oldest and most prestigious order of chivalry in the British honours system. The appointment of its royal members depended directly on the will of the sovereign. And then came February 2022. In the message the Queen published on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of her accession to the throne, Elizabeth II publicly expressed her sincere wish that when Charles became king, Camilla would be recognised as Queen Consort. It was not an anonymous leak. It was not an unconfirmed version. It was a text signed by the sovereign. The full arc of that trajectory is impossible to ignore. Distance in the years after 1997, the first public sign of acceptance in 2000, attendance at the wedding blessing, and hosting the reception in 2005, progressive institutional honours between 2020-21, and finally the explicit endorsement for Camilla to hold the rank of Queen. That trajectory does not support the image of a queen who maintained an absolute and permanent block against Camilla in all areas of her life. What it shows is an institution managing an unprecedented situation with extreme caution, moving slowly, but moving forward. And yet, amid all that progress, one fact never changed. Camilla never lived in the apartments where Diana had raised her children. Why Camilla's absence from Kensington did not need a ban. Having reached this point, we can formulate the question more precisely. If the Queen progressively integrated Camilla into the institutional life of the monarchy, why did Camilla never move into Diana's former apartments? The most honest answer is that no order was needed for that not to happen. The sum of existing circumstances was enough. The first was the most practical. Charles did not need Kensington. He had Clarence House, renovated specifically for him starting in 2003, with his offices, his staff, and his domestic infrastructure. There was no functional need to return to the apartments he had shared with Diana 15 years earlier. The second was the actual state of those apartments. After Diana's death, the spaces she had occupied remained unused. They were not maintained as a museum or a ceremonial space. They were simply closed, and over time they deteriorated. When renovation work began in 2008, builders found facilities in worse condition than expected. The image of the intact, perfectly preserved bedroom does not correspond to documented reality. The third reason was symbolic and political, and perhaps the most powerful of all. Installing Camilla in the apartments where William and Harry had spent their childhood with Diana would have created an image that no communication strategy could have managed. It would not have been just a domestic decision. It would have been a visual statement, Camilla occupying Diana's space in the place most intimately associated with her memory. That image would have arrived at a time when popular mourning for Diana was still a huge cultural force. It would have generated a reaction of a magnitude difficult to calculate. The fourth reason has to do with the nature of Kensington Palace as an institution. It is not a private property of the royal family that any of its members can freely dispose of. It is a historic complex that includes residences, offices, areas open to the public, and spaces managed under the supervision of historic royal palaces. The assignment of its apartments depends on institutional criteria, functional needs, maintenance costs, and security considerations. It is not a decision made in the privacy of a family conversation. And the fifth reason was the most lasting. After 1997, Kensington became the place of Diana's public memory. Its gates had received the flowers of national mourning. Her funeral cortege had departed from there. Her children had chosen to place a statue there. Every photograph of Camilla arriving at that residence would have been read as a substitution. Every appearance of hers at those windows would have evoked the woman who was no longer there. The combination of those 5 reasons means that the question of whether Camilla lived in Kensington is answered without the need for a secret ban. Logistics, politics, symbolism, and the simple availability of a better alternative already provided that answer. The apartments after Diana. There is a chapter of this story that is rarely told in detail, and that is more revealing than many of the versions that have circulated. For approximately a decade after Diana's death, apartments 8 and 9 remained without residential use. That silence was interpreted from the outside as a sign that the space was being preserved, that nothing had been touched, that the rooms remained just as Diana had left them. The reality, when renovation work began in 2008, was much more prosaic. The Guardian reported that year that the former residence had been closed for a decade, and that the costs of the work had exceeded initial estimates because the installations were in a more advanced state of deterioration than calculated. The heating system, in particular, required much more extensive interventions than anticipated. That does not describe a sanctuary. It describes a house that had aged with no one living in it. With the renovations, the layout of the spaces changed. The grand unified residence that Charles and Diana had occupied ceased to exist as an integral domestic unit. The rooms adopted new uses. According to information published in later years, Parts of the former apartments were used as work zones and reception spaces linked to the official activities of William and later Catherine. However, precise details about which parts of the complex were assigned for which use have not been made entirely public, so that information must be presented as what it is, published journalistic data, not a fully verified institutional blueprint. The irony of what happened has a power of its own. Camilla never moved into the space where Diana had raised her children. Instead, areas connected to that former residence ended up serving the work of the next generation. Not because the Queen had personally reserved those rooms for William and Harry. Not because a document stipulated it, but because the spaces were adapted to the needs of those who would occupy them next. The rooms Diana had turned into a home stopped being a home. They were transformed into functional spaces, but the change of use did not erase the past. It made it more visible, because the further those rooms moved from the private life Diana had built in them, the more the connection between her name and those walls intensified in the collective imagination. The room that no one could occupy. At the end of this journey, there is something that needs to be said clearly. There is no credible public proof showing that Queen Elizabeth II issued a literal order banning Camilla from entering Diana's bedroom. No signed document has been presented. No official statement appears. No contemporary journalistic report from a serious publication described at the time Camilla trying to claim those apartments and being stopped by the sovereign. What is documented tells a different and in many ways more interesting story. Diana maintained Kensington as her residence during the years of separation and continued living there after the divorce until her death. The apartments remained empty for approximately a decade before being renovated and allocated to other uses. Charles and Camilla established their London home at Clarence House, not at Kensington. The Queen's position toward Camilla evolved over time from initial distance to progressive institutional recognition, culminating in explicit endorsement for her to be Queen Consort, and Camilla never occupied the space where Diana had lived with her children. All those facts are verifiable. None of them require the existence of a secret band to be explained. Why then did the legend survive with such force for so long? Because it answered something that documented reality could not resolve. It was not solely a question about where Camilla would live. It was a question about whether Diana's memory could be protected from substitution. And the ban offered the cleanest possible answer. Yes, at least one space remained untouched, at least one door remained closed. The legend did not need to be true to be powerful. It only needed to answer a real fear. Over the years, the distinction between what was said and what was proven began to disappear. Words allegedly became secretly. Phrases saying sources' close claim transformed into facts asserted without qualification. And the verifiable fact that Camilla never lived in Kensington was rewritten as a scene where she tried to enter and was stopped. That is how legends grow when the actual space remains closed to the public. A true fact connects with an authentic emotion and produces an explanation that seems inevitable, even though it has never been proven. What Diana's room really was, the room the world kept calling Diana's, was not a bedroom kept behind a locked door. It was something more complicated and more significant. It was William and Harry's childhood in those apartments. It was the years when Diana returned to Kensington after each public engagement and found her children upstairs. It was the period when those rooms had been the refuge from which she tried to build an independent life while her marriage deteriorated. It was the photo of Diana sitting at her desk in those apartments, which so many people remembered. It was the image of her children playing on the top floor while she worked below. It was the door that photographers had captured so many times, and from which she had departed toward engagements that would make her one of the most recognized figures of the 20th century. It was, in the deepest sense, the place where Diana became herself instead of being solely the Princess of Wales. No renovation could replace that. No change in layout erased that layer of history, and no person, whether or not they crossed the physical threshold of those rooms, could appropriate what those years had meant. Camilla got the marriage, she got the honours the crown could confer. She finally got the explicit approval of Elizabeth II and would end up holding the rank of Queen Consort. But she could not go back in time and become the woman who had raised William and Harry in those apartments. She could not replace the mornings and routines Diana had there. She could not separate her history with Charles from the breakdown of that marriage. That was the room that no one could occupy, not because a guard was posted outside a door, but because it was occupied by something that cannot be evicted, either by a royal order or the passage of time, the history of what had happened there, and the memory of the woman who had lived it. In closing, this investigation does not intend to strip dignity away from any of the people who form part of this story, neither to idealize Diana, nor to demonize Camilla, nor to simplify the decisions that had to be made by a queen who ruled for 70 years. What it intends is a more modest and perhaps more valuable thing: to separate what is known from what is imagined, to show that documented reality is more complex, richer, and in many ways more revealing than any simplified version. The legend of the Forbidden Room survived for decades because it responded to a genuine emotional need, the need for a space to belong forever to Diana, for history not to be completely rewritten, for at least a part of what she had built to remain beyond the reach of substitution. That need was understandable and human. What is not possible is to present as a proven historical fact what was, at best, a legend generated by a combination of collective grief, distrust toward the institution, and information gaps that limited access to Kensington Palace, never allowed to be filled. Diana's room existed. It was apartment 8 and 9 at Kensington Palace. It was the home where she lived with her children for 15 years. It was the place from which she built her independent identity. It was the palace from whose gates the country went to mourn her. All of that is true. All of that matters. And all of that is enough, without needing to add a door that was never documented as closed. If you found this investigation useful, let me know in the comments if you believe that the spaces where important historical figures lived should be preserved as they were, or if it is correct to transform them to adapt them to new uses. It is a question that goes beyond Diana and touches on how societies decide what deserves to be remembered and in what way. And if you value stories about the royal family investigated with care, where verified facts are separated from repeated versions without losing sight of the human dimension of history, subscribe. Here we will continue to look for what really happened behind the palace walls.